In today's beginner video, we're exploring the art of flattening boards using two simple yet effective tools, the random orbital sander and a straight edge. As you can probably imagine, there's a wide range of sanders out there on the market. However, for beginners, I recommend a basic random orbital sander, something like this Makita here, which is just under $100 and works extremely well. Now, of course, there's more expensive sanders out there. For example, this one coming in at around $600. And you may be asking yourself, why does this sander cost so much money? It comes down to mostly the quality of its construction. Durability over time, especially with heavy commercial use. It has additional features, and the higher quality sander will produce a smoother finish. By no means do you need a sander like this one as a beginner, and honestly, most people will never need a sander this nice. In case you're not familiar, a random orbital sander is a palm-sized sander with an aggressive pad to which sandpaper attaches. What's great about these sanders is the pad moves in an orbital direction, meaning it rotates and shifts its position in a random elliptical manner, for the purpose of producing a sanded finish that doesn't have circles or swirl marks. Now, I won't get into too much more detail about sanders because I've done a full video on it, and I'll leave a link up here and down in the notes section. The other tool we're going to be using is a straight edge. This one costs under 20 bucks. What I like about this one is it's actually really thin, which makes seeing light underneath of it really easy. And I'll unpack what that means here in a few minutes. Before diving in, examine the board for any major bumps or twists. One of the best ways to first identify imperfections and high spots is to use your eyes and your hands. Your hands are surprisingly good at identifying imperfections. Lightly run your hands over the surface and make a mental note of what you're feeling and what you're seeing. To further identify exactly what's going on here, let's use the straight edge. To use this tool, simply place it down on the board and notice if the straight edge rocks or moves in any direction. It's helpful to move it in multiple directions to get a better sense of what's going on. The main idea is to identify the high spots, because it's those high spots that we're going to be sanding down to meet up with the lower spots to make the board flat. Another helpful tip is to position your board so that you can get some light on the back side of the straight edge. For example, when I hold this straight edge here, you can see light coming through on the bottom. Therefore, the sides of this board are high, making the center section low. Sometimes the face you want to flatten first will be the opposite side, where the center is high and the edges are low, making your straight edge rock or tip to one side. For today's video, I'll be flattening the side where the edges are high. To mark the location of these high spots, let's start at one end of the board and use a pencil to mark where the gap begins. In this case, it's about here on this side and here on the other. Again, we're looking for the transition where the light comes through and where it doesn't, or where the gap ends or begins, depending on how you look at it. Once that's done, pull the straight edge towards you now a few inches and work your way all the way down to the other end. In a lot of cases, your markings will change slightly as you work down the board. Once those marks are all made, simply draw a line that connects them like this. And then color in all the high areas with your pencil. What this does is it gives you a guide to know which material needs to be removed. And it gives you a confirmation of when that material is removed because the pencil marks are gone. And I'll show you this here in a few seconds. Before we do start sanding though, I do want to mention that this only corrects the board in one direction. After this is complete, we'll turn our straight edge 90 degrees and work on the long grain direction of the board. When it comes to choosing the right sandpaper, you're going to want to start with a more aggressive grit, somewhere around 100, and work your way up from there. However, if you feel like you're not removing material fast enough, or you know you have a lot of material to remove because you've noticed huge gaps in your straight edge, you might need to jump down to an 80 grit or even a 40. Sanding progression generally looks like this. Sanding progression, for those that don't know, is the order in which you use sandpaper. So for instance, if I start with an 80 grit, my next step would be 100, 120, and so on. Sanding progression is important because each paper above the one that you started with removes the previous scratches. Generally, you're going to want to sand up to about 180 to 220 grit, depending on the finish that you're putting on your project. All right, let's start sanding and just see how things go. With 100 grit sandpaper installed and my sander hooked up to a shop vac, and don't worry, if you don't have a vac, you can use a dust mask or sand outside if you can. I'll start sanding only where I see pencil marks. As you sand, don't feel like you have to put too much pressure on the sander, just enough to engage the paper into the wood. The idea here is to let the sander do the work and let the random orbital action work for you. I'll sand until I no longer see pencil marks, making sure to cover all areas as uniformly as possible. I'll also taper my sanding, meaning I'll go over in the areas without pencil marks slightly, just so I'm not creating a sharp edge. Once the pencil marks are all gone, I'll go ahead and spend a few more minutes in those areas. Once complete, grab the straight edge and check your work. Here you can see that we did make some improvements, but there is a little bit more work to be done. Repeat the process of marking where the new pencil lines need to be. And in most cases, you'll notice that the lines will be in a different position than they were before, and that's a good thing. With everything penciled in, repeat the sanding process. With that complete, let's take another look and see where we're at. And I see, yes, we're actually looking really good right now, so I'll stop right there. With that direction looking good, let's move on to the long grain direction. Here I can see that there are a few very small spots showing up, but for this board, the work we did previously really helped out in this direction as well. If it didn't, keep finding those high spots and slowly work it down. Once you're satisfied with your results, I recommend checking the board in a diagonal direction as well, repeating the pencil marks and the same sanding procedures as you've done before. Because I'm happy with the overall flatness of my board, I want to go ahead and clean up some of these deep saw marks still left in the middle, which your board may not have, or you actually may want to keep some of those for character. To do this, I'll leave the 100 grit paper on for now, put pencil marks over the whole board, and sand it until I'm happy with the look. Before you start moving to the higher grits, just double check that the board is exactly how you want it and that you're satisfied with it. Because once you start progressing up in sandpaper grits, you're going to actually start sanding the entire board, preparing it for finish. Before we end for the day, I do want to provide you with a few helpful thoughts. First, this method will flatten the board, but it will not make the board equal in thickness. For example, you may have sanded more on one side than the other, meaning that one side of the board is now thicker or thinner than the other. Sometimes, however, this might not even be noticeable, so it just all depends on how bad the board was to start from the beginning. Second, I just demonstrated flattening one side of the board, so if you're going to do the other side, you're simply going to repeat all the steps that we've already covered. If you do the other side, you will notice that the middle now will be high. So you'll be spending more time there and not so much time on the edges. As you progress in your woodworking skills and as your tool budget increases, you can look into buying things like a jointer and a planer to help you do this process a lot faster and with a lot more accuracy. The last thing I'd like to say is that practice makes progress. So let the sander do the work. Never feel that you have to press the sander down hard to get it to work better. If you feel like you have to push really hard down on the sander to get it to work better, then simply just drop down a grit or two and let the paper do the work. Flattening boards with a sander is not only an effective method, but it's also accessible for all beginners. With a little bit of practice, you're going to be able to master the skill of creating smooth and flat surfaces. If you have any questions, as always, you can hit me up in the comments. Find me on Instagram. That is actually the best platform for me to help you. Hope you're having a great day. Thanks for watching. God bless.